This lens is made by a company that I think is great at making lenses, but terrible at marketing. And the result of that is they have produced the sharpest budget lens ever made, but nobody's ever heard of the lens and nobody's ever heard of the company. And when I say this is the sharpest budget lens ever made, I'm not just talking about my personal opinion and my experience, although that is true as well. This lens has been objectively tested by a website called DxOMark. This is a website that tests phones and camera lenses and speakers and a wide range of technology related products. And one of the things that they test is lenses. And in their testing, this was the second sharpest lens that they've ever tested. And most of the other lenses in the top 10 of this list are at least 3 to 5 times the price. And this lens actually sits above a lens that costs $13,000. So that's the kind of value we're talking about. The optical qualities you're going to get out of this lens for the price point are absolutely unmatched. And in addition to all that, in my testing, there are no deal breakers with this lens. Everything from the build and handling to all the optical performance tests I've done, it either performs perfect or near perfect, or at least well above average. This lens was sent out to me at no cost to myself, but all the opinions are my own, and this is not a paid or sponsored video. This is the Yongnuo 85mm f1.8 lens, and this is a full frame lens that works equally well on APS-C sensor cameras. I'll put some links in the description down below. It currently comes on 3 different mounts. The Sony one is somewhat easy to find. The other 2 can be a little bit harder, so I'll try to update those links. This is a company that most people have never heard of, so I did have to search around and find a few places that you could buy it. Now, importantly, this is not a lens that just renders beautiful test chart images. I'm sure that's how the DxOMark people tested it. But in my real world shooting, it is an absolutely beautiful lens, and I'm just loving the images that I'm getting out of it. Now, in my use, I found it a perfect portrait lens. 85mm is a traditional portrait lens, and you are going to get that eyelash sharpness that you get out of a lens that has this level of sharpness and detail. The other thing that it's very good for is even when you are back a ways, because you're at 85mm and f1.8, you're going to be able to get some subject separation and some subject isolation by blurring out the background, even without being really close and getting a head and shoulder type shot. You're going to be able to get back and you're going to still be able to get that subject separation. And for this reason, 85mm lenses are extremely popular with wedding photographers. And wedding photographers often carry around 2 different cameras with 2 lenses on them. And one of them is often an 85mm f1.4 or 1.8 lens. And because of that, when you use a lens like this to take portraits, when you show them to your friends or family, they almost always look like these professional portraits or wedding portraits that people are used to seeing. So if you're interested in taking photos of people specifically, then this is a fantastic lens for that. And this is the lens that probably a lot of people don't think of for street photography, but I took it out and did some street photography with it and absolutely loved it. And I thought it created some really compelling images that were completely different than what I was typically getting with a 35mm field of view on a full frame camera. And at times I even used the crop sensor mode on the camera to punch in and get a sort of different look or an even tighter field of view. So I would not be afraid to use this lens in a street environment. And the other thing that's really nice about this lens as an 85mm and using it for street, it is still a small lens. And if you just have a look at it compared to my 35mm f1.8 full frame lens, they're very, very similar in size. Now, typically 85mm lenses tend to be a fair bit bigger, but you can see that they have kept the size of the lens very, very similar to the 35. So you're not going to be any more conspicuous going out with this 85 than you would a typical 35. The other thing a lens like this would typically be good for is product photography or food photography. The one thing that I will say with this lens is its close focus distance is about 80 centimeters, which is similar to the comparable Sony model. But this isn't really super close. So if you've got a small subject or a small object, it's going to be a little bit harder to fill the frame. If you've got a high megapixel camera, you can go into crop sensor mode and probably get a bit more detail and get a little bit tighter framing. But there were times that I wanted this to go a little bit closer, but I still was able to take some of these detailed shots and get some halfway decent shots with the lens. The other thing we have to address is this is an autofocus lens by a company that you've never heard of, so we expect that there might be some problems with the autofocus or it might not perform on par with a first-party lens. In my experience and my testing so far, it has been very, very similar to the Sony lenses I own and use on my Sony camera. There was at no point that I thought, oh, this thing is performing in a way that one of my Sony lenses would not have. So I have no concerns with the autofocus. It works equally well in photo and video. It is not an extremely fast autofocus in the lens, so I wouldn't consider it something maybe for sport. For general purpose walk around photography and video, it's perfectly fine. The next thing we'll have a look at is the build and handling on the lens, and I will compare it to the Sony 35mm because these lenses, I mean, they feel like brothers to each other. They're so similar. Even the layout of the autofocus manual focus switch, I mean, they're just so similar. So build and handling, if you put this lens on your camera and you're used to any of these Sony f1.8 all metal build lenses, then this Yongnuo is going to feel very, very similar. You're not going to be feeling like you're using a budget lens whatsoever. When we look at the distortion performance on this lens, it is a little bit unusual, but you do see this in 85mm lenses sometimes, and that is it exhibits a small amount of pincushion distortion. This can be corrected in editing, but it is an interesting one, and I have heard portrait photographers that prefer a little bit of pincushion distortion because it is more flattering on the models or people and makes them look a slight bit slender. So it is kind of like this mini Photoshop editing, but in the lens. But it is something, I don't think I have any other lenses that really, traditional lenses that exhibit pincushion distortion. So it is just something to be aware of, not a deal breaker or problem by any means. The lens does have reasonably heavy vignette, and the vignette doesn't actually go away. So it starts at f1.8, it's very strong, all the way down to f8, there is still vignette. This, once again, can be corrected in Lightroom or editing. That is not an issue. And I don't mind vignette for portrait lenses or lenses like this because I almost always add vignette to that type of photo anyway. So everything you've seen in this video, photo or video, I have not corrected the vignette whatsoever. Chromatic aberration is another one that does cause a lot of problems for budget lenses. The chromatic aberration performance on this lens is perfect. I can find virtually no fringing whatsoever. If you zoom into like 400%, you might find a little bit of something. But once again, nothing in this video has been corrected, and I didn't feel like there was any distracting elements from chromatic aberration. Looking at longitudinal chromatic aberration, which is a change in color cast in the out of focus areas before and after the plane of focus, there is the most modest amount that you will find if you absolutely go hunting for it, but it is barely relevant, and for the use of this lens, it is a non-issue. Flare performance is another place that this lens far exceeded my expectations. The flare performance was near on perfect, and there are a number of places that I go and do very specific type flare tests with all these lenses, particularly in the church because I've got these big spotlights and windows. And in all those scenes, it performed near on perfect. You got a slight bit of blooming around the lights themselves, but for the most part, I really couldn't get this thing to flare or bloom or desaturate at all. There are clearly some situations that you can get it to flare crazy, but in all my real world testing, even when I was going looking for it, it really wasn't an issue. Having a look at close-up image quality, the close-up image quality is excellent. I wish it focused a little bit closer, but this isn't unusual for a budget 85mm lens to have a bit of a further minimum focus distance. But when you did that, the image detail was great. It was super sharp, and I didn't feel like you got any of that ghosting or slight loss of contrast with the close-up images that you do with some lenses. So sharpness and detail at the minimum focus distance was good as it is as at infinity. And looking at the sharpness on this lens, obviously this is the whole thing about the lens. It is the sharpest budget lens I've ever tested. It is the sharpest budget lens DxO Mark has ever tested. And the rendering of the details, particularly when you're taking a picture of an object or someone's face, just the eyelash sharpness is just insane for a budget lens. Just insane. And the images should be speaking for themselves. And finally, looking at bokeh and background blur, and I will often say with lenses like this, you are going to have a small part of your frame that's in focus, might only be 15 or 20%, and the rest is blown out and out of focus. And because of that, I think the quality of that out of focus rendering is as important as the sharpness and detail. And I think this lens does it very, very well. I don't think it is, if the sharpness in this lens is a 10 out of 10, Then I think the bokeh and background blur might be a 7.5 or something like that. I've seen better, but it is creamy and smooth and dreamy and not distracting, while not necessarily having some crazy amount of 3D pop. But when I look at the quality of the background blur combined with the quality of the sharpness, you still are not going to touch a lens that has these two features as good as they are at this price point. There's nothing even close. Now, once again, because it's an obscure lens, it'll be a little bit hard to find. I'll put those links in the description down below, and I'll try to update those. So let me know if you can't find it or whatever. I'll try to keep those updated. And if you want to improve the quality of your photos or videos without buying a new lens, I've just thrown a video on screen now. I think this is the best tutorial I have ever done on photography. And if you haven't watched that video, I would really encourage you to watch that. I genuinely think it will make a difference in the images that you're capturing.